Hello. It's right now 1 o'clock, and now we have many experts and many people from the finance sector, people related to the developer sector, and they are all very punctual. So we are here to start on time and finish on time. I would like to start the session by first thanking all of you, your attendance, and that you've been so kind to come with us in this session. And I would now like to move on to the content. My name is José Luis Suárez. I am a professor at the ESE school, and I have the honor to moderate this panel. Here I have Donato Muñoz. He's General Director, General Manager of Cebasa. This is one of the big names in the rent sector in Spain for many years, because rent had a long-standing path where it seemed nobody would rent, but now, however, it's really ongoing, on trend. Now we have Luis Marza García. He's the chairman of the Association of Developers in Catalonia, and he is the person from the sector of reference here in Catalonia, also with great knowledge at national level. So we will have the opportunity to learn from him and to know about the situation of this sector all around Spain. And Joaquin Castelvi, he's a partner and head of European acquisitions of Stoneweg. Stoneweg is an investment fund, a foreign investment fund, as many others operating in Spain, but it had the virtue of starting in very interesting promotions and developing a well-designed for rental, the famous build to rent. Everyone's speaking about the build to rent right now. We need it, but we do not have so many operations as we could, and that's why we have this is why we are honored to have Joaquin with us. I will start in this same order. Donato, you can be the first. And as I said before, we didn't rent that much before. Now we're renting more, but the signals we receive from the rental market are not very clear from my point of view. It's true that the rent is going up, is increasing, speaking about younger population, but in general it seems there's a trend of using things instead of owning things. This is why we speak about renting houses. But I've seen surveys of millennials who are not thinking to buy in the short term, but many are thinking about buying in the long term. So this is something we should study and analyze, because sometimes we could think renting is due to their need and not because of their convictions. I will leave that for later, okay. But we can start by the development of this renting sector, because it's an increasing sector, a growing sector. And yes, it's growing. You are right. The demand of rent is also growing to a great extent due to the lack of possibilities to buy, actually. And this sometimes it's not a question of personal preferences. Sometimes it's because of employment situation, etc., that people end up renting. We've had many years where the rental market was not very good, since 1998. Well, at this point in time, the rental market was at the same levels of the market to buy homes, 50% and 50%. These started to reduce, mainly due to several laws and tax reforms, and around the 80s the renting market almost disappeared. There were also protected households with high levels of inflation that made the debt in just a few years would be outdated, and they started to be quite affordable. Then the Spaniards started to be owners instead of tenants. and people just didn't rent. It was just in the hands of private entities and in companies such as mine, but our presence was very low. We are one of the few companies, I believe, whose only purpose is renting, and we started to work with protected houses renting. I think this statement that you've done is exactly what the reality is about. Some do not think about buying in the short term, but maybe they have the goal to buy in the long term, medium term, and it's logical, of course, because the rental market needs to be affordable and plays its role according to the demand. However, it's not a bad idea that in the future we will see what happens now. If we think about the retired people here in Spain, the capacity to buy according to their pensions and that they are owners of their homes, they live in a modest way, but they can go on. If they had to pay a rent, taking into account their low pensions, they will be in a very vulnerable situation. If we now think about the future, we see that pensions are in quarantine. There is no guarantee that we can keep the purchasing power for the future. And if, in that sense, if the households, for people who are thinking about the retirement, if they are going to have to rent a house, they will need to face pensions with a doubtful guarantee and the payment of a rent, which in the best of the cases may be just affordable. So this is worth to reflect about it. What is the role we have to play? What is the role of renting houses in the economy and in the society? And these clear rules are not there. We are only having short-term policies. We are always in urgent situations, but we cannot. But there is no policy for renting houses for the long term. We need to think about affordable houses. There needs to also be space to buy houses at affordable prices or with prices that really have a direct relation with the cost of production, so that the construction cost and the selling cost should be reasonable, because it may be more efficient for the economy, and under this threshold we cannot create this kind of household. So we should speak about social subsidies to help families or other people whose income do not allow them to access affordable households. It's true that the rental has its place and has its role, of course. Sometimes it's better to rent than to buy, but you were very right when you were saying that retired people, well, it reflects the value of savings that the property or the household will have. Because if there is a risk for pensions, then you would also need to pay rent. Well, we need to think about it. And then there's also the crisis we've just gone through. If you allow me for a second, if we think about the rental cost, currently the financial resources are really cheap, almost zero at macro levels. I mean 1%, 1.5% for the end user. So the cost of the financial resource is lower than the capital investment for the household. So in this scenario, we need to take advantage of it, at least meanwhile this equation is favorable for us. One question, can you hear properly? I hope you can. Yes, okay. Now, in the world of developers for sales, I think here we have some contradictory data. The prices had a rebound at the end of 2014, the prices of the households, and now they are increasing, but it seems they are not increasing at the same path in different regions. And the volume was also increasing, the volume of sales, but some data we had around the summer, August, September, are not so clear in terms of sales volume. What can you tell us about this market? Well, of course, the market has been growing since 2014, as you very well said, where there was demand, enough demand, and mainly in the big cities there was an increase which was sometimes double-digit increase. And there was a dichotomy in the whole Spanish territory because there were places where the houses were growing and in some others it was decreasing. In Catalonia, we all could also see this kind of effect. In Barcelona, it was going up, but in Lerida, it was going down. These figures, well, they've been correcting over time. The increases have been lower. And regarding what happened in June, July, and August, well, it's quite distorted. The information we have is a bit distorted because of the change of the mortgage law and the interpretation of this law, because there have been some differences in interpretation according to different territories or notaries understanding the law on a different way. This generated distortions that we are hearing, for example, today, that the data of August are from the registrars, and they notice there's a decrease. Before it was the notary. So, this is the problem. But in general, in conclusion, it's true that the trend is growing. The sector continues to have a constant development, and there could be small signs in certain areas of the interest of demand going down, mainly due to the macro situation, and in some places also due to electoral uncertainties in Spain and also the problems of Catalonia, but these are quite slight yet. There is an indicator, I believe, which is at the background of all this, which is the trust of the consumer. The confidence of the consumer is critical, mainly to buy these kind of things, for example, a household, and the trust of the consumer may have slowed down in the last years. Well, maybe not now, but you can tell us what you expect about the evolution, which is so important for the following months. But now, Joaquin, maybe the build to rent. What do you do so that the figures are okay? Because the operators sometimes complain that the price of the plots is very important according for the development of building, for example. But it seems in rental, the tenant is more demanding in terms of the location. So you need to go to places where the plots are more expensive. So how do you do it? What do you do to make the whole operation affordable and also profitable? One step back. Let's take one step back. And I will tell you about our experience in the Spanish market. We are all aware of the interest rates, and we probably all agree in the sense that they are going to stay that way for the following years. So there's a great appetite for assets that generate cash flows. And probably, even though many of us, and I am speaking from Stoneweg, selling in Europe many assets that generate cash flows, such as offices, logistics, buildings, hotels, our investors are very happy, but nowadays I could say we were wrong. The whole things we've been selling in the last couple of years probably will have a higher value today. And this is a trend that we believe, or at least when you're going to meet certain institutional investors, that this is going to be so for the next years to come. So if you take a look at Europe, you have, of course, the UK, where every minute you go into Twitter, you don't know where you are. And with the prices we have nowadays, the risk you are assuming is not paying for that uncertainty. So the UK market for many investors is a bit complicated. Maybe this afternoon it may change. We don't know. In Germany, if you go there in terms of capital values, the values of the properties, they are really too high, very high. And with some capital structures that are quite aggressive in order to get returns of over 10-15%. Aggressive, I mean with that, there were senior banks, then you have sometimes junior banks, and then you are giving the 10-15% equity to get that return. That's the situation in Germany. Then if you move to France, you will have a similar problem because in terms of values, all the assets are very high. This generates opportunities, but they didn't do the reforms that everyone considered necessary in that country. So you have like 3 different markets, which were the main receivers of capital, where things are not so clear. And to end up with Spain, you have Portugal and Greece. We move on to the southern countries, where due to their size, they are small. Their market is small. And in Italy, what we've seen, because we have a high presence in Italy, is that everything is concentrating in Milan. So you have Milan and then the rest of the country. And there's still appetite, but it is more difficult to penetrate in the market and generate volume. And then we come to Spain. As we've well seen in the last couple of years, there's a lot of foreign capital coming in, and this trend will continue, in my opinion, because in relative terms, this country continues to be, in terms of price, it may seem to you more or less expensive, but it's still competitive. And within the strategy of generating cash flows, people find it hard to visualize investors where you may have 20 portfolios of more than 30,000 households in Germany, and in Spain you just have 1. Therefore, that's why we get to the build to rent, because there's a lot of capital believing that portfolios can be created normally only through developing to generate this 10,000, 13,000 to generate cash flows, recurrent cash flows, for the different investors who are desperate, because as we know, the starting point in the past was 0%, and now we have negative figures. So where do you move around? And now coming back to our experience in Spain for the build to rent, we are doing this in 2 different ways. We have promotions in our portfolio where we have decided to do the sale to one of those potential investors. But those potential investors who are AXA, for example, M&D, they do not want to have a risk for development. So you may sell for a price for square meter or global, the number of households in that promotion, and there's a mechanism through which they are paying you and you are leaving some margin for you. Having said that, we do not want at all to get the maximum average price of that promotion. So if we are able to sell 250 units to one single customer, that's much better for us. And then we like to play around the capital structure to see what's the margin you've lost and compensate it with a financial structure. This is the way the very few players in the market are approaching us to get that volume. And little by little we will see a clear trend, so that they are going to buy plots and they will assume the developer risk in their balance to have the units at a lower price versus if you're going to directly buy them. And we hope to be an important player in the market that tries to create one of those portfolios. As you said, there are very few operations in the build-to-rent. As a sentence, it's quite fashionable now, but there are few operations of build-to-rent. You've done some of them. The AEDAS is also very famous, but there are few others. Why is this failing? It's because people just don't see this calculation that you do? Well, there are two problems here. One is you need the access to capital structures that are a bit more sophisticated, because if in the promotion you can define three risks, one is the licenses, second is construction, and then the sale. If you manage to mitigate the with a AAA investor such as AXA, Ares, you will have construction, and mitigating those two, some investors will be willing to enter into the capital structure apart from the bank and feel comfortable because you managed to mitigate those two risks. I think that's one of the main problems, because an efficient capital structure, that's what you mean, to help you get a profitability and compensate the profitability that you are losing because of the margin of the developer. And Donato, in the protected households for rental, you do not have that much margin for a sophisticated capital structure. You have your equity and the bank financing, right? Well, in fact, we have lower margin in general, but we do have efficient financial structures, I would say. There are public bodies financing this kind of operations. They may be national, such as the ICO, or the Finance Bank, or the European Investment Bank at the European level, or even the Bank of the European Commission, that allow us to have access to better financing conditions that you would never get in the private market. You mean the conditions are probably in terms of terms or period, because costs are low in the market? Yes, but if you go to the retail market, it's not the same to go to a triple A at the wholesaler market. You cannot access to those interest rates. So through these kind of bodies, you can access those kind of interest rates that will help you to improve the return. These structures can be as efficient as the ones explained by Joaquin. Another different issue is the build-to-rent is a new way coming out. We've used this modality in some kinds, not to sell but to buy, and we will use it even more if it were feasible. What are the problems that we face usually? Sometimes we have a problem of price, because our margins are really very adjusted and without the possibility to recover them in the long term, because prices are tapped. So the moment of the sale is really determining, and there are some prices we just cannot assume. But if the price is okay, then we do it. Sometimes we work as a developer, and in that case we assume the risks. You have the licenses as a risk, you have the risk for construction, the commercialization. Well, that's something we know and we can minimize, but again, the question is, what is the cost this uncertainty has, which could be reduced as well if the administrations would be a bit more reliable. Because if you buy a plot where you know you're going to get the license in the short term, is very optimistic, so there's a risk which makes the whole build-to-rent system be more expensive, which for companies such as ours is ideal if you can manage it. And minimizing the risks will help us to approach our different positions. Yes, I would like to add something and complement with some data to what Donato is saying for the difficulty of protected houses for rent and for sale. The modules through which the prices is governed since 2006 have not changed, and construction during this period of time has increased around 44%. These are official data. One reason for this increase was the inclusion of the technical code, which meant an increase of around 8%. At this point, building protected houses, in many cases, it's not viable. If only in the case of very well structured buildings, big buildings, otherwise it is not feasible. One of the things that Donato has explained, and I would like to complement, is that this a stagnant situation at the administrations do not provide solutions to the problems of household. We need to think that when we speak about affordable houses, in order to use the official language, is these are freehold properties or protected properties or agreed price properties. And what the administration should do is just build and assume the losses. This would be the special regime. And I think this data would help for the discussion and for our public to focus on this topic. In fact, there's only one factor mitigating this effect, which is the low interest rates. Otherwise, it would be completely unthinkable. There's another factor. If we speak about protected houses, where I am very sensitive because it's my main business, it's the raw materials. The big providers or manufacturers are the big developers. The developers have or give it to the city councils in a payment of 10%. Therefore, the plot for protected houses is basically and fundamentally in the hands of public administration. Therefore, it is especially necessary to have certain collaboration between public and private entities to develop these plots of land for that purposes. Both of you have spoken about the policies or the regulations. You were speaking about the lack of a long-term policy, and the protected houses doesn't solve what it should be solving because it's cyclical. It's in a cycle. Usually protected houses are fewer during recession. So it's a paradox really, because there should be more and because there is a higher need for protected houses, and in recession or in slowdown of the economy you see there are less. So from your point of view, Luis, this is, I guess, very interesting for you. Out of all the prior crises, whenever we've gone out of a crisis, it's always been promoting official houses. It's the first time that we went out of the crisis without promoting official houses. Information from Catalonia. Houses finished last year, 7,500, around that. Out of them protected, 633. And promoted between all the administrations, public administrations, 60. Yes, you heard right, 60. So we see that there is a need for protected houses, most of them for the rental market. We are hearing this message, but last year only 60 promoted by public administrations. The 4-year plan that you were speaking about, assigned to Catalonia, divided into 4 years, between 50 and 60 million. The previous year, the city council didn't allot any amount for this, and this is the sad situation we find here in our sector. And this has an impact, of course, in the first access to households. It has to do with everyone, of course, but mainly for young people.
Joaquin, you talked about your business from an international standpoint, which is where you can appreciate Spain's attractiveness, but you operate in different areas, don't you? Anyway, so considering your unique standpoint, how would you compare the different regions? What's your opinion on the market right now? Spain can be favorably compared to other countries, but do you think the market is sufficiently solvent and resilient, as people say nowadays, so as to receive an activity like yours? Are you planning to expand into other regions? What do you think about the market? Yeah, obviously, to us, Spain is still a strategic country where we want to be present. And we want to be present in a number of ways with different strategies. When we started out in 2014, 2015, we saw a clear opportunity in development, primarily in residential development, but we also worked in office projects in Barcelona and Madrid. We did urban hotels as well. And the different asset classes in Spain, well, amongst all of these, we're going to be active by buying more land for development, but we'll also be thinking about renting. That's our plan for the next 12 months. We'll be active in logistics as well, from a development point of view, because to our knowledge, that's where most of the earnings can come from for our investors. And we still like some hotels, hotel opportunities both inland and along the coast. And as Jose Luis pointed out, we were among the first ones to give out loans in this country, about 300 million actually worth of loans, and that's an activity we can keep on offering as long as we're present in Spain. Okay, and as far as regions go, where does your preference lie? Right, we have lots of strategies, but generally speaking, we'd like to understand where the macro of each country is. Then we apply that logic to the real estate sector, and we draw conclusions. As far as real estate goes in Spain, we've started 3 residential development projects in Europe, in Milan and in Dublin. In Dublin, for example, we have 4 pieces of land, 2 for sale, 2 for rental. So those are the markets we prefer, alongside Spain as well. So talking about inputs for the market, we'll be talking about land. Not so long ago, it seems like our previous cycle ended with a great availability for land, and now the demand has become more selective, and still it's eaten away at land in some areas more than others. What do you think about that? Because I think raw materials are starting to become scarce in terms of pricing and availability. Well, that's proportionate to demand. If we're working, for example, in a marginal province that's not very attractive, it's easy to acquire land, but if you're looking to work in a successful city that is very, very attractive, that attracts lots of talented people, obviously there's more demand for land there. Lots of buildings are already occupied. You need to build more to meet that demand. After the crisis, despite all the pressure to make land more available, a number of measures were adopted, but there is a big mismatch between demand and availability. When buildings are already occupied, they're not on the market, no matter if they're being used for sale or for rent. At that point, you need to develop more, and that needs to match the demand increase in demand. And I think this hasn't happened in Spain, and I think the upstream market is responsible for that. There isn't enough housing, there isn't enough free housing, there isn't enough social housing, because it goes hand in hand with free housing, and free housing normally finances social housing. So if no free housing is developed, no social housing will be developed, because there is no raw materials, there is no availability of land for it. And the truth is, we haven't matched the rhythm that was being imposed upon us by the market itself. There are lots of buildings that are completely occupied, and they're large buildings. And we need more land. We simply need more land. We've become slow, basically, in developing, and that's incredible. Before the crisis, the problem was the lack of resources, basically, to invest in land. Now we have the resources that we'd need to invest in land, but there is little urban development. And it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the future, and as a result, it's hard to plan ahead. So there's a lot of uncertainty. This is creating a lot of uncertainty, and we're immediately feeling the repercussions of this, the effects of this. So right now we're able to deal with emergencies, but we're not meeting all the demand. I completely agree. Free housing is killing social housing. The previous government had the good virtue of doing free housing with private market. Yes, by involving the private sector, obviously you have an intermediary. You create responsibility. Those who pay for housing are responsible for it. So you create responsibility, responsibilize your actors. It's 10% for this, 15% for that. No, those who pay are the people who want to live in that housing, in those buildings. Exactly. So in that case, the users are paying. Correct. That's correct. And they become responsible. So, I don't know, free housing purchases, how much they can bear. Yeah, it's like petrol prices. We know which part of that is taxes. The same, we should be able to find out about free housing. That's a good idea for some academic research, perhaps. So, talking about land, Lewis, where do we need more land? This lack of land, what impact does it have on pricing? And what are the prices like now? Give us some data, because you have all of them, really. Yes, so I have some data regarding Catalonia. Donato explained it very well, but there's something I'd like to add to complement. A piece of information that might strike the audience as surprising. Throughout the crisis, these tax measures have been recurrent, pro-cyclical. Let me explain myself. All of you are professionals, and you know that payments are cascading. In the year 2000, it was 0.50. Now we're at 1.50. 300% growth. Now, the local administration proposed that the cost of construction should be increased. There's always increases on housing tax. So I'm saying this because we shouldn't forget it. It's a significant cost, as you rightfully pointed out earlier. And regarding land, as Donato was saying, Barcelona has areas where you can still grow, but there's small areas. Barcelona will keep on growing in the metropolitan area. But let me make a comparison between Barcelona and Madrid. It's what we usually do, after all. Barcelona has 1.6 million inhabitants, Madrid 3.6, and it's 6 times as large. The metropolitan area, well, the metropolitan areas are quite similar, and about 3.2 million people live there. The metropolitan area is where we have the land reserve to keep on growing, but we need to execute our plans. We need to start all the administrative procedures in order to urbanize this land. We're still solving some problems that we inherited from the crisis, and some landowners, some landlords can't currently plan ahead. They can't currently execute. But if we ask for loans from banks to further develop the city, we'll probably get denied. That's a problem, and the administration needs to deal with it. If there is no offer, if there is no supply, well, we know the rules of the game here. No supply, prices go up, and that's not what we want. Yes, in Madrid, over the past 4 years, land prices tripled. The development area, north of Madrid, Valdebebas, it's over 2,000 euros. And that's happened because of what you just said, lack of adequate policy making in terms of land development. Joaquin, you talked about your investors earlier, and you explained yourself quite well in build to rent. What they want to avoid is the typical risk in development construction, as you so elegantly put it. These investors want to mitigate the risk of construction, but that's something you have to face, right? Well, my team, not just me. So how do you deal with that risk? Because construction has generated a number of problems in development recently. I don't mean to say that construction itself is a problem. What I'm saying is the relationship between the two is problematic. Prices have gone up, as Luis was saying, and this price increase in construction is problematic, as is compliance. Construction is based. Construction is basically not attracting as many people as it could. So we have problems relating to price, and we have problems relating to deadline compliance, which has in turn caused some serious problems to some good developers that are quoted on the market, listed on the market. Listed companies have public plans that are made public, so some of them weren't complied with precisely because of these difficulties that were encountered in construction. So this is a shared problem between development and construction. But anyway, my question basically is, what is your relationship with construction like? What happened over the past 3 years? What are the perspectives? So we started in late 2014, early 2015. And when I say I started, I mean we received the first proposals for residential projects from constructors, and since then we've seen a significant price increase. Having said that, thanks to our team, all of them kept saying that this was an ad hoc occurrence. Nobody thought that it was going to be a long-lasting trend. Everybody thought that prices couldn't permanently go up in a price like Spain, considering the unit price for raw materials and so on, 600 to 700 euros, depending on the type. Nobody thought this increase would be permanent because it wasn't viable. Simply, it wasn't viable. So we were lucky enough to be able to quickly revise new acquisitions and factor that increase into the cost, which had a positive repercussion with our investors, because now they feel comfortable with all of our parameters, all of the parameters we presented them with whenever we had a purchase operation to propose. So regarding listed companies, I think the approach is similar. The capital market, of course, itself is slightly different because it's quite aggressive, and it's got certain construction costs and license deadlines and delivery deadlines that are different. So a dynamic has come about whereby in the last few years you go to London, you sit down with your investors, and all they talk about is cost inflation. So you need to keep expectations low with your shareholders and investors. That was a reality for a while, but now you don't get asked these questions. You get asked, at what pace are you selling? So it's change. That's a tough question. What's your opinion on your relationship with constructors? It's all about innovation, really. Constructors. Well, it's something people are talking a lot about now, right? Industry 4.0, people keep saying. Yes, that's absolutely correct. There is a lot of concern regarding this possible innovation, but that's something that needs to happen. We need all of our processes to be more automated, easier to predict, to forecast. We need to offer guarantees in terms of price and delivery times, compliance, which, well, all of this requires that the construction system become more industrialized. So we need to be more predictable, basically. That's what I think. It's not as urgent for us as it is for Lewis, in my opinion, though. What do you think, Lewis? Well, the crisis, as Joaquin and Donato have pointed out, has destroyed the entrepreneurial texture of those companies that cooperated in construction. Now, we haven't been doing a lot in that regard. In Catalonia last year, for example, we initiated construction for 14,500 housing, and we lacked the manpower to comply with delivery deadlines, and that's the reality. That's what the situation is. But in Catalonia, I also want to say this year, something will happen. That considering the indicators from our first semester, if in 2018 we built 14,000, we started building 14,500 buildings, but we're expected to grow by 10.5% in 2019. So, sorry, a decrease. It's a 10.5 decrease. We will be building less. And we're actually required to build a gross total of 25,000 new homes, and this factor is only mitigated by Barcelona. In Barcelona, the pace is higher. Sorry, in Barcelona the pace is lower. In Tarragona, Lleida, the construction rate is higher, but in Barcelona, construction rate is falling. In the first semester, there was a 68% reduction. Barcelona is paralyzed. Licenses have been suspended in certain neighborhoods so as to exhaust the local assets, products. But a little over a year ago, Barcelona approved a legislation whereby it consolidated land. 30% of these plots of land needs to be reserved to social housing. So something must have happened considering the figures we have. Another thing, even more worrisome, the Generalitat approved a decree for housing that was aimed to create new conditions for this 30% ruling. One that could be applied to most of the places where housing was being built in Catalonia, consolidated land. What am I trying to say? Well, that we need to be very, very careful with the decision we make. I think this administration and the future administrations will have to analyze what's happening in Barcelona really, really carefully, not make any rash decisions, otherwise the sector is likely to become affected, not only in Barcelona, in all of Catalonia. So What we need is legal security if we want to be able to develop. This brings me to my next question, Joaquin. This international comparison that you made earlier, Spain, in that one, stood out as an attractive market from an economic point of view, in terms of expected profitability. But considering the political situation, well, how's that affected? I think we can't help but discuss it today. It was difficult to even enter the building, so we can't ignore that. We can't ignore the political situation level. So many elections, and yet we don't have a government. There's been a lot of talk regarding Italy. Italy has worked without a government in the past. Italy is actually a good example because on an international level, Italy has been decaying basically evidently over the past few decades, and you can tell in Milan. It's a beautiful city, granted. Italy was one of the founding members of the European Union, and yet nowadays it's not as paid attention to as it was in the past. So not having a government is not good. How does that affect international investors? Of course it's important. But there are some nuances to all of this. Let me explain. 2016, if I'm not mistaken. In 2016, for about 300 days, we didn't have a government. So eventually, we told our investors, okay, we now have a government. The next 3-4 years will be peachy. October 2017, there was an event in Catalonia. So again, we had to explain ourselves. 2018, things seemed to be going fine, and all of a sudden, we got up and you got a new president. 2019, everything seemed to be fine. The elections were held. We almost formed a government, and now, well, there'll be more elections. So it would be great to finally have a central government for a period of time, along with regional governments as well. It would be great. But the political map in Spain is now used to dealing with these occurrences. You go to the UK, for example, the situation is similar. France, yellow jackets. Italy, it's a disaster. The US, they also have their problems. And I remember this very well. I once had a conversation with a few of my investors, and they told me at the end of it that they were worried about the situation of the US because, they got up one morning and they opened the newspaper and found out that 100 people had been killed in a mass shooting in the US. So, political uncertainty, that's something we must deal with. You can't avoid it. But it just means you need to go back to first principles as opposed to governments. Yes, unfortunately, right now things aren't going well. But as you said, you make the most of the situation. But I think anyway, it's an important moment to ask politicians to be responsible. Of course. It's not ideal, clearly. No, it's very unpleasant. Anyway, we've got a few minutes left before we wrap up. If you like, I'd like each of you to tell us a little bit about your predictions for the future. I think our public might be interested in that. So, what are your forecasts for the next year, from now till October next year, till the next Barcelona meeting point? So new developments, new projects, are prices going to go up or down? What do you think? My feeling is that prices are going to stay stable next year. Are you talking about rental? I'm talking about rental and sale. there will be uncertainty at the same time. Prices will stay stable, but we'll be working with low volumes, which, of course, is more bad news. In terms of what, sorry, production? Us? We're a closed capital listed company, so our fund is constantly investing. Hopefully, we'll be able to carry out some interesting financial operations next year, but not a lot of them, just a couple. That's our prediction and plan for next year. Would you rather buy or develop? That's a good question. I think you should ask Joaquin that question, really. I'd like to buy, really. I'd like to purchase, but if I have to develop instead because I don't have a choice, so be it. I trust that there will be more political stability and that we will be able to start designing a housing policy that is good for everyone, one that is better informed and one that sees us more involved, because this uncertainty means that there is less commitment around. Each and every time you have to decide whether or not to invest, you need to look at possible subsidies, restrictions, and so on. That's very complicated, and to me, obviously, and to investors like me, that's an obstacle, it's a hindrance. That needs to be solved, and as long as it's not done, the situation won't change a great deal. Yes, I agree. Lewis, over to you. What can you tell us about next year? What will the market look like all of next year? Same trends, do you think? What about prices? I think I agree with what Donato said. There is uncertainty regarding another couple of situations that I mentioned earlier, and all of this is related to new legislation, what this new legislation will aim to incorporate. We saw what happened with the statal law after it changed. The landscape, I think, is ever-changing. In Catalonia, for example, we have a serious problem that is squatting. It would seem like now finally we'll be able to change the corresponding law, and that will help us solve this problem. A problem that is a lot more serious in Catalonia than it is in Madrid or in other autonomous communities. I'd like to be listened to. I'd like to become involved in policy making, because if we cooperate, we can finally solve the housing problem and not have to spread false information, not have to create false expectations. The housing problem is a global problem, and we need to be rigorous and serious. All of us need to make a pledge to save housing in a reasonable way. What about pricing, Lewis? What can you tell us about prices? What are your predictions? Will they be stable? Will they increase, decrease? It depends on the location. Give us a couple of examples. Well, the territory that's coming out of the crisis now, Tarragona, Lleida, prices won't change a great deal, but in Barcelona and metropolitan areas, well, supply and demand law, that's what it is. If we don't supply a lot, that's bad. And we're making land price increase. Eventually you have to explain that to us, that law that you mentioned a couple of times, supply and demand. Your predictions, Joaquin, and then we'll wrap up. Well, that's hard to add to what Donato said in terms of rent, sale, and so forth. All I can say is I trust that more foreign capital will be entering this country, and there will be, I think, more institutional investors that will take their chances and decide to invest in this rent portfolio that we have in Spain. I think that will be a remarkable trend over the next 12 months. So I think a new key player will be coming into the market and will need to adapt to this. These investors will need us, so we need to adapt. I think there is sufficient capital and expertise in this room, and we'll be able to meet the new capital demand that will manifest itself in this country. Well, so we're finishing at 2 o'clock on the dot. So I'd like to thank our speakers, our experts, Donato, Luis, Joaquin. Thank you for talking to us about the current situation. I hope we can afford the luxury of being optimistic with regards to the future. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the session. Thank you.